she always had a ocean and its creatures. While attending Clemson University, uh, I'm reading right. Okay. She found that she had a passion for participating in 3 years of coral reef research through Creative Inquiry Program. Caroline and fellow researchers visited Florida Keys quarterly, where they transplanted corals and collected data. Once they were back at Clemson, they would analyze the data and photos and present their findings. This sparkled a love for corals. I love that sparkled a love for corals and scientific communication for Caroline. So she's going to turn her sparkle into her presentation and share it all with us. So Caroline, thank you for sharing your wonderful experience and knowledge with us. And I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I was looking through all the names and I love all the familiar names and faces, and I'm so grateful to Nikki and Colin and CMNA to allow me to talk to y'all again on Think and Drink Night. Last time we talked about dolphins, and this time we're back in the ocean talking about corals. And yeah, I hope that you learned something new. And of course, if you have any questions, I can't wait to hear all of your different things. But again, my name is Caroline Heap. My day job is working at the county parks as a naturalist with Keith and Christina. And so yeah, that's kind of my first role. But I have, like Nikki said, some background of choral knowledge from when I went to Clemson University. So um, I'm just gonna go through this fun PowerPoint, and then hopefully you'll join us on the walk on Saturday. And we can see some corals, but I also brought some to like show you up on the screen too. So let's get started. So we're gonna mostly be focusing on corals of South Carolina, even though my background is mostly Florida Caribbean species. A lot of it translates and are some similar things. So we're gonna go through and talk about that. Oh goodness, get my, there we go. So just some lesson targets today. We're going to talk about defining what coral is and in its anatomy, describing species in South Carolina and reef habitats in South Carolina, and then discussing threats to corals and how to mitigate or stop them so those threats don't continue. As always, like to leave it on a conservation message. So just some fun pictures of me and my history with corals, just so you're not like, why is she talking about corals? I just like to kind of give some credibility statements to why I'm passionate about it. And but it all started in Clemson. Landlocked school, didn't have a lot of opportunities to learn about the ocean, but I found a way. And we would go down to the Keys quarterly and collect data. So here's some shots of me snorkeling and scuba diving in the Keys, collecting data, usually by pictures, and then mostly looking at corals, but also coral reef fish and lobsters, spiny lobsters in the reef there. And it's a national marine sanctuary, so we got to kind of experience what that looked like. And yeah, just collect that data, see what happened to the corals after some bleaching events, which we're going to get into what bleaching is in a little bit. And then I also learned my passion and love for educating through that too. So I got to do poster presentations and teach people what I learned through our research, and that's really what sparked my interest in educating people. So thankful for that path too. Speaking of which, all the way to the left is a picture of me at South Carolina Aquarium in front of our Great Ocean Tank when I worked there for 3 years. I got to kind of start that education about coral reef, um, ecosystems and learn a lot more about South Carolina and how it's different than Florida or the Caribbean as far as corals and coral reefs go. So just a brief little Carolina coral history there. But we'll dive into what you actually came to hear about, which is our corals. So, um, first of all, I like to say like corals are kind of they're a mystery to a lot of people. Some people think they're plants, some people think they're animals, some people might just think that they're just some weird little thing out there. And they often get confused with sponges and things like that. So we just want to define what is a coral. So kingdom, they're animals. The Animalia, they are an animal, just like you and I are animals, but they're tiny, and so a lot of people kind of overlook them. Um, their phylum is Cnidaria. So Cnidarians, so that first C is silent. Cnidarians have soft bodies and they have nematocysts. Corals are related to sea anemones, sea pansies, jellyfish, or jellies, sea jellies, however you want to say that. They have nematocysts, which are those stinging cells that are like little harpoons that come out and will sting their prey. Just if you've ever got stung by a jellyfish, same mechanisms that corals use, but just on a smaller scale. And so corals usually don't sting us, but some species do. Um, and then they're kind of, if you look at this photo, of this like zoomed in polyp. It looks like a tiny sea anemone. And that's pretty much what all of their little polyps or little bodies are, is tiny sea anemones. So they have that soft, squishy body and those stinging cells, which is all of Cnidaria has that. Then the class that corals are in are Anthozoa, and that includes corals, sea pansies, and sea anemones. Sea pansies you might have seen on the beaches. They're like little heart-shaped, pink or purple. Um, they're Nigerians, just like corals. So you might see them washed up and have like a little siphon little thing that sticks out. They're pretty cute. They're pretty cute. So, and then with the anthozoas, the adults are attached. So this is how it splits off from jellyfish, right? So jellyfish, the adults are what we call like a medusa. They are like squishing around and they're free floating, where the anthozoas are attached. So sea anemones are sessile. They attach. Oh, sorry, guys. They attach to a rock or a seashell and they don't move as adults, but the larvae of them are free floating in the water. If you remember your class for Master Naturalist and you're looking at the zooplankton, some of those might have been larvae for these cnidarians. So either corals or sea anemones or sea pansies. But then they attach as adults and don't free float. Um, Order is Gorgonia, and then I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's like Scleracidina, Latin. Um, but
Sure.
those are, I put two orders
Scleras-
because we're talking about two different
Sclerastina.
categories today. One is soft
Sclerastina.
corals, which are those gorgonias or gorgonacea. And then the hard corals are reef building corals, which is that second order with the scleractinia. And then just a few other coral characteristics down here. They filter feed with those little polyps. They're going to feed through just floating things. We call it marine snow, that just floats around, and some of it's microscopic where we can't even see it. And they're filtering that out and putting it in their mouth. As you can see in this photo here, their mouth is in the middle, and they have little tentacles with their stinging cells. So they're catching stuff with their tentacles and then putting it in their mouth. If you ever have seen a sea anemone eat, same thing there. Some corals, but not all corals, are symbiotic, and we'll talk about that too. So they have these tiny little algae cells called zooxanthellae. So you can see that here in this zoomed in picture too. These little algae cells are symbiotic. They get protection from getting eaten by things by living inside of the polyps. And then the zooxanthellae create sugars through photosynthesis, and the corals feed off of those sugars on top of filter feeding. So they have two ways of getting food. And then most corals have a calcium carbonate skeleton. So I have some corals beside me here. So if you can y'all see my picture off to the side? Maybe, Nikki? Yeah, okay. So hopefully y'all can see this. It might not be super big, but I can also show them at the end once like the PowerPoint's over. But this is calcium carbonate. So this is what's left over. The coral animal made this skeleton out of calcium and nutrients that they pulled from the seawater. And then they deposited it into this skeleton, and then all of the little holes is where the polyps would be. And they get to kind of hide in those polyps. Or the little cups are called calyxes, and they suck themselves into that calyx or that little cup and are safe from getting eaten um, if they're scared. So that is a type of calcium carbonate skeleton. Um, and then this is a sea whip, which we'll talk about in a second. And they also have that it's a calcium carbonate, but it's a little bit different. It's more like silica that creates their kind of more soft but still structured skeleton. Um, so just a brief little introduction to what is a coral. So it is an animal, and they do have plants inside of them sometimes that are symbiotic. So hopefully that clears some things up. We have this little thing down here. We're going to really dive into hard versus soft and the different types of coral now. So soft corals, we'll start there. Soft corals are also called octocorals because they have 8 tentacles on each polyp. So I talked about polyps. I have an example here too of a polyp. Um, Obviously, they're not this large. They're very, very tiny. But the tentacles for octocorals only have 8 tentacles. So these are all their tentacles. They only have 8 for soft corals. So they don't need the symbiotic algae in their polyps. They can live with less sunlight because of that, because they don't need those algae to create their sugars. They don't need to have a lot of sunlight, so they can live deeper. They can live with less sunlight. And then they also have these branched rods of flexible protein surrounded by the polyps that are connected by a matrix that kind of looks like glass called spicules. So they're not these like reef building ones that we think of. These are softer. They kind of flow in the water, in the current. They're going to flow back and forth, bend a little bit, and then live deeper. And but they have usually sometimes when you find them on the beach, which hopefully we will this weekend, they have like a little base to them that helps attach them to the sand or a rock, and then it's all built with these like little spicules that help like the structure to grow. And then on top of that, the colored part is what where the polyps are that would come out and filter feed in the water. Um, so that is a little bit about soft corals. And so now we're going to go over some species of soft corals that live in South Carolina. Um, so corals are interesting because South Carolina doesn't have a lot of hard bottom really close to shore, right? Like we talk about the South Atlantic Bight, which I always use my hand with my thumb being Florida, and that like cut out of my thumb is where we live in South Carolina, where the continental shelf is like way out. And so we don't have a lot of that hard bottom structure. So these corals oftentimes are in deeper water and offshore a little bit. But they can also grow, under docks. I know I've seen these soft corals grow pretty close to shore before too. And our water is kind of turbid, right? Like it doesn't, you can't see through it very well because of the sediments that flow through our water. Um, and that's okay with these soft corals because they don't need as much sunlight. But we have two different species that we can find off of our coast. One is the regal sea fan, which I don't have an example of one today, but beautiful regal sea fan. Sea fans have more like branches off of their each individual like little well, each branch it branches more off of that, kind of looking more like a tree or a fan, like those old-time fans. Um, and I wanted a picture of both one alive in the water, so you can see that here, and then one on the beach that it would look like when it was dried out a little more and not living anymore. And then also of their polyps up close. So you can see what those tiny little polyps look like when they're coming out of each of those branches. Um, then we have um, what I would consider more of a common species to find. That's the colorful sea whips. So they come in orange, pink, and yellow. So that's why they get their name colorful sea whips. And that's what I was holding up earlier. This is a yellow one. And this is what they look like alive. They're kind of fuzzy looking because all of those polyps are out filter feeding. And then when they wash up, they still have some of that color, but sometimes it will come off. And they might have other things growing on them. So they do provide habitat. Both species provide habitat for other species that of crabs and snails and all sorts of other things. So yeah, so that is our two species in South Carolina of our soft corals or our gorgonias that have those eight tentacles there. So soft corals, moving on to hard corals, which are my favorite. Excuse me. So hard corals are reef building. So that's when you really think of like a coral reef habitat, you're probably thinking about hard corals. These big, rocky looking, tough corals and colorful corals of all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So that is our reef builders. They secrete, like I said, that limestone calcium carbonate structure, and then they have that little calyx or cup, like in this illustration here, where they can kind of suck in their polyp to protect themselves. So some of these hard corals are obligate symbiotics. So they have to have an algae cell inside of their polyps called zooxanthellae, which is a fun word. Zooxanthellae are those tiny algae species that live inside of these polyps, and some of them are obligate. They have to have that to survive. If they don't have it, then they can't really feed themselves. As they kind of have filter feeding, but their main source of food is from the photosynthesis of those algal species. And some of them aren't. So some of them can survive without those zooxanthellae, and they're fine with it, and they don't have to worry about those coming in or out or whatever. But they all do build that skeleton and the reef base and provide shelter for a number of animals. Coral reefs are known as the rainforest of the sea. They have a lot of biodiversity of different animals and algae and all sorts of things. So uh, that coral is the base of that. That's gonna be like the linchpin for the rest of these animals and that habitat. So without the corals, there's not a coral reef. And those polyps, some animals eat those too. So they do provide food, which you might think, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Why would the animals eat the corals? But there's certain fish species that enjoy coral polyps. And I saw that a lot in Florida. We have parrotfish, and some of those live off of the coast of South Carolina too. And they would take their big teeth and scrape the corals and eat those polyps. But corals were pretty resilient against that predation and would grow back pretty quickly. Um, and but what also was great was that those same fish would eat algae that would compete with those corals too. Different algae that lives inside of them, because there's more than one species of algae out there. Some are helpful for the corals, and then some compete and overgrow the corals. Um, but the hard corals, unlike the soft corals, need more sunlight usually. They need to live closer to the surface in shallower waters. And those ones that don't have that obligation to a symbiotic algae can be in cooler and deeper waters. But usually they like to be closer to the sun. So, going into our two species of hard corals in South Carolina. These are both non-obligate ones that don't need symbiotic algae. So our waters are cooler in South Carolina and are less sunlight. Like I said, it's more turbid and they have less sunlight and it's deeper. So these two don't require those symbiotic algae cells called zooxanthellae. They are mostly, or they're obligate filter feeders instead of relying on those algae cells. So we have two different species. One is compact ivory bush coral. So I have a few examples of bush coral here. Um, Compact bush coral is probably our most common one that we find washed up on our beaches. If you find a piece of coral on a South Carolina beach, it's most likely going to be the ivory bush coral. Um, just like the name suggests, it kind of looks like a bush. It has branches. And then you can see an example here of it alive.
Going to the house or truck or what?
Hmm?
In the
No, in the
house.
house.
Um, so you can also see those calyxes, those little indentions where the polyps would live. But what we're finding is that skeleton, that calcium carbonate skeleton washed up on the beach after they have passed. The second species is our star coral. So star coral, um, I think the polyp, like the little calyxes where the polyps live, look like stars, but also the polyps themselves, as you can see in this picture of it alive, are kind of star-shaped. They have longer tentacles. And you'll see this often too, but I just somehow think I find more of the other species. But I have a shell here, and you can see that it grows like on the shell. Um, and I find a lot of pieces like this where the star coral has grown um, on a seashell or some other hard structure. These are my examples are actually both on shells. So that is our star coral. So South Carolina, like I was saying, like with the South Atlantic Bight, doesn't have a lot of these naturally occurring hard bottoms. If you think about Florida, there is naturally occurring limestone, there's corals. If you think about corals like oysters, like we learned about oysters in class, might have been a while, but oysters have to grow on other oyster shells. So that spat has to develop on top of another oyster shell. Corals can be very similar. They need a hard structure to grow on. It could be a former coral that had passed away and its skeleton is left over, so its larva will float around and then find that hard structure and grow on top of an old coral, or it might be limestone rubble or rocks. So certain places around the world, like Florida or the Caribbean or Australia, they have that naturally occurring hard bottom where those corals can grow more easily and not have to have humans come in and maybe plant some things. But in South Carolina, we do not have that. We have soft bottom unless we go way, way, way offshore where we have some really, really deep water coral reefs. But closer to shore, what we do is make artificial reefs. So artificial reefs can combat that little to no naturally occurring hard bottom, but also combat low coral cover. So if there's a place that's like really struggling to get their corals to grow, they can plant some different artificial reefs to help them to grow. And then it also can give more habitat to species, including fishery important species like fish and vertebrates that we eat, and are ecologically and economically important. So there's a few ways that we can do that. These two pictures here show what we call reef balls or reef cones. So in at Fort Johnson, right next to the Oyster Reef building area, there's a coral reef ball area, and that's what I was doing here. I got to do that when I worked at the aquarium. We mixed concrete for like a whole day and made reef cones. And they have these molds that are like trademarked, and they have those little holes in them so fish can swim in and out of them, and the surface area is just right for corals to grow. And then the picture of the barge is them putting them out in the ocean. And this is actually from DNR's website, South Carolina DNR. And they're throwing those in there, and they have to do that in certain places, and they have like certain reefs that they keep track of. So they're not just like randomly throwing them out there. They know exactly where they are and how many they need and things like that. So if you buy a South Carolina saltwater fishing license, part of that money goes towards these reef cone builds. So super important for our reefs. But they don't just use these concrete made reef cones. They also use rubble from different things. So also from DNR's website is this tank that's in the bottom of the ocean off of our coast. And you can see some coral growth on there and then also some fish using it as habitat. And then this middle picture is a example of one of these stars on the far right picture. These stars, each of them are a artificial reef. And then this, if you zoom in, this is all on the website. If you zoom in, you can see what each artificial reef is made of. So I liked this one because it said they used the old Cooper River Bridge rubble and sunk it, and that is some of the artificial reef. There's also some barges, some old military materials, concrete materials, Highway 41 bridge rubble. So um, I like that they reuse and kind of recycle these materials instead of them just going to a landfill. They took the old Cooper River Bridge and created reefs with it, which is super awesome. So these stars are all of the reefs along South Carolina's coast that DNR has planted different materials to create hard bottoms for our corals to grow. Some of them you can dive on and visit, and some are in what we call like a marine protected area or like a no-take zone, so you can't fish off of them. But some of them you can fish off of, which is why that fishing license you buy goes towards this, is because it attracts those fish that fishermen are after, and that we can eat and things like that. So really important habitat and structure is put into these artificial reefs. So now I want to kind of transition into why do reefs matter, and talk about some things that maybe are threatening reefs, and then we can talk a little bit more about some different corals and things too. But why do reefs matter? So there's two sections to every kind of why does this matter thing in natural history. One is ecosystem functions, and one is ecosystem services. So ecosystem functions are what does the species or habitat do for its like fellow like species, whether that's animals or plants, or whatever it is. So ecosystem functions in the reef's case, they provide habitat and a nursery for fish, and other creatures like crustaceans. They provide food, they provide oxygen and water filtration. And so all those things, obviously, we love animals and plants, and so that's enough for us, right? Like, okay, yeah, we want to protect corals because they're beautiful, they're wonderful, and we love nature. But sometimes when we're educating, I find that some people really have a more an easier time having empathy if they know the ecosystem services, which is what it does for people. So reefs are a natural barrier. They can provide barrier from hurricanes, storms, wave action, especially if they're off the coast. They can kind of slow down some of that action. They're a nursery and habitat for fisheries and important species, which I mentioned before. So the species that provide food for us, they provide economic wealth in certain ways, and then recreation and tourism. So if you like to scuba dive or snorkel, then you know that that's important, and it's great to have these species around. But I just like to cover both of those when I'm thinking about why do we care? And I know that I don't have to convince you, but just so you know, if you're talking about corals with someone, when you're volunteering, that you can use both of these. So now we're going to talk about some threats to corals, and this is going to be on a worldwide scale. So this probably includes South Carolina corals, but also includes our species around the world of these corals and reef systems. So one is pollution, ocean acidification, overfishing, irresponsible recreation, and climate change. So we're going to go through each of those individually, and explain why those are bad, even though you could probably guess. Um, so pollution, waste from industries, agriculture, households enter the ocean, and sunscreens count too. All of these pollutants get into our waterways, no matter where you are in the country, in the state. They all rivers lead to the ocean, right? So those things wash down and they can affect our corals. They can affect a lot of animals, but today we're talking about corals. So they can weaken corals, making them more vulnerable to disease and bleaching, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, and I'll explain what bleaching is. Or it covers them up, preventing them from photosynthesis or even preventing them from filter feeding if that's their main source of food. Um, Even if it's like liquid pollutants, those things can block the sunlight from coming in or even cover them and suffocate the corals. I like to plug sunscreen here. Um, I prefer using sunscreens that are considered reef or like nature safe sunscreens, which are also safe for us. I use one called Stream to Sea, but any like zinc or mineral sunscreen is best for any ecosystem, but specifically corals. I know there's certain states like Hawaii, and parts of Florida that require you to use those sunscreens, and that's because those corals, um, if you think about some of those chemicals are on our skin, they wash off in the water really easily, and they cover the corals just like they cover our skin. So uh, I usually just try to steer towards those mineral sunscreens when I'm swimming, but usually all the time because once you wash it off in the shower, it also gets in our waterway. So that's a little bit about pollution. So then ocean acidification, So this is caused by excess CO2 from fossil fuels burning, and it dissolves in the seawater, forming carbonic acid. So this is like, if you love chemistry, you'll love this graphic. It breaks down the two. It does carbonic acid and bicarbonate, and I took 4 years of chemistry at Clemson, but I focused more on my coral research than that. So I know they go hand in hand, but essentially the water is getting more acidic. And if you think about these cute little corals and their calcium skeleton, um, it's going to dissolve that skeleton or at least weaken it. So it's going to make them more brittle, and not as strong as they're growing. It also like stunts their growth. And it makes it harder for them to regrow or rebuild themselves after a bleaching event. Again, we'll cover bleaching in a little while. Um, so ocean acidification is huge, and y'all might have heard, it's really hard for crustaceans and sea snails and other things that create a calcium carbonate shell or exoskeleton or endoskeleton. So just thinking about that, and what a cool experiment to do if you ever need to kind of demonstrate this is take a seashell and put it in vinegar and let it sit for a while and then see how brittle and like powdery it gets after just a little bit, because that acid really changes it. But and then this little fun fact here, if I can get, I can't see. Okay, there we go. Since the Industrial Revolution, ocean acidity has increased by 30%. And that makes the corals more fragile. So, um, yeah, so that is ocean acidification as one of our threats to coral. Overfishing, I briefly touched on this just a little bit ago, but this photo on the left of the coral, this is coral that has been overtaken by a competitive species of algae. So there's different types of algae out there that grow very quickly, especially in warm water, and can suffocate a coral. Some algae species will actually like have stinging cells too and like sting the corals. Um, and so that is really uh, they overtake it, and then the corals can't filter feed and they can't photosynthesize, and so they end up dying and being overtaken by the algae. So we talked a lot about this when I was doing research, and we really like calculated, or not calculated, but like would tally like, okay, what algae species are on the reef, and um, how much is their like percentage of coverage around the corals, so we could see if they were affecting it, and we found out that they did. And so we actually published a paper about that, which was really cool. I can send that to Nikki if y'all want to read a scientific paper that I was like the et al. At the end of the author list. But it was a really cool find to figure that out. So, but what does that have to do with fish, right? We're talking about overfishing. Fish, like I mentioned earlier, eat algae. So a lot of fish love to eat. They're herbivorous, and so they will eat those um, algae, and they will protect the corals by keeping those at bay. All a balance, right? So if we have those fish, then they'll eat the algae and the corals will be safe. But if we are overfishing that specific species, then those algae won't get eaten as quickly. So overfishing can be a huge problem. And luckily, we have really great DNR and license and all these different regulations on fishing, so we know. But there's always research going on about what's best, and There's always mistakes and people not following the rules. So overfishing is a big thing for corals. Irresponsible recreation, it probably breaks my heart the most. And we would see a lot of this in the Keys, and it's a little easier in more shallow reefs, as you can see, like people standing on corals, which can break them off and then cause them to die. People collecting corals when they're still alive, it still happens around the world. Of course, I have a handful here that were already dead when I found them. I would never take them out alive, just like sand dollars and other things. You want to make sure that they are no longer living. But like I said, also being careful about like what you take, like with the oyster shells. Like, we don't want to take all the oyster shells out and then they have nothing to regrow on. So a lot of these were found on the beach where they were not still being a part of that growth cycle. And then I have my collection and I'm not collecting anymore now. I like that rule that Andrea, who a lot of y'all have heard from too, like if you get your collection and you're using them for education, then try not to collect anymore. Um, and then improper like anchoring, some people will anchor on the reef and then that will break corals off too. Or these are prop scars from people driving their boat through coral reefs and not realizing how shallow it is. And also seagrass beds that are important for the habitats as well. Um, so yeah, this is why y'all are so important and why my job is so important is because these are all preventable by education. A lot of these are that we're talking about threats, but this one is the biggest one. If people knew that that was bad or wrong, then they wouldn't do it. So that is that one. And then this is the biggest one, climate change. So excess CO2 doesn't only increase the acidity of the ocean, but um, is also, creating this warmer, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Let me get some water. Um, so excess CO2 is increasing the temperature because of the excess of the greenhouse gases. So those gases are trapped in the atmosphere, and then the water absorbs heat faster than the air. So the ocean temperatures are increasing faster than the air temperatures. So corals have this very specific little window of temperature. So they need like this threshold, you could say, of like cool temperature versus hot temperature. And if they're 2 degrees over that threshold, then they will be stressed out. So sorry, I feel like there's like a lot of background noise. Can y'all hear a lot of background noise? Okay, good. I'm seeing a note from Nikki. I just didn't want it to be too loud. Um, I think someone outside is like doing something. Anyway, back to corals. So, because of that threshold, that very specific temperature range that they need, those 2 degrees above that temperature threshold will cause them to be stressed out and then usually cause them to bleach or die. Especially this graph here is from 2023 and 2024. This is in Florida, but I think they have similar graphs for South Carolina. The longer that they call them degree heating weeks. So, if it's just like one really hot day and the water is like so hot, it's like a bathtub and you're like, oh my gosh. But then it cools down the next day because maybe we have a big rain. The corals are usually like, okay, fine, like the water temperature is balanced. But it's the longevity of it. So if there's weeks on end of this like boiling water temperature for the corals, that's when they're going to get stressed and bleach and die. So that's how climate change is affecting these corals. That longevity of those hot weeks of water that is above that threshold can really affect um, the health of the corals. They can get diseases more often, and they can spread disease more rapidly. It also, but it increases the number and intensity of big storms, which can just tear up corals and like just destroy corals as well. But the flip side of storms is that it cools the water down, and so then it won't be as hot. But there's always that like silver lining in those storms or hurricanes. So hopefully that made sense. Sorry, it was a little jumbled there for a second. I was like, this outside noise is distracting. Um, but anyway, so climate change and corals is just a big conversation. But I want to define bleaching now. Oh man, my text got messed up. Um, so coral bleaching, I have mentioned it multiple times. A lot of these different threats and stressors will cause corals to bleach. Um, I talked about the zooxanthellae. So bleaching, our corals, like I said, are not obligate, um, like symbiotic algae cells. But so this is really applying it to Caribbean and Florida species that have to have those zooxanthellae, that have to have those algae cells inside of their polyps. So this doesn't apply to ours. Ours would not bleach because they don't have those, if that makes sense. So what happens though, so ignoring our star coral and our ivory bush coral, going more to our Caribbean species, our Florida species. This is a staghorn coral that I have here. Um, so they have the polyps, and inside those polyps, like in this picture, those little green dots are zooxanthellae. They're the algae cells. They provide sugar and nutrients to the coral through photosynthesis. But what happens when a coral gets stressed out is those zooxanthellae are like, ugh, like this is not a fun place to live anymore. I don't want to live inside of this coral. It's all stressed out and it's hot. And so the corals will expel their zooxanthellae. They will spit them out and say, hey, get out of here. I'm stressed out. I don't want to deal with you. And the algae cells are also just like, ugh, I don't want to be in here. And so they are expelled. Well, these zooxanthellae are what give coral their color. So then they look white. So they might be still alive and have their polyps out filter feeding, but they're completely white, hence the term bleaching. In turn, this also makes them weaker and more vulnerable to disease and to death. So they lost their main source of food and then their color. The color's not super important, that's just why it's called bleaching, but they lost their main source of food and they might get disease or eventually die. They can't live off of filter feeding alone. So what happens is they look like this. They lose all their zooxanthellae, they lose their food, their color. Um, it's due to that stress. So rise in temperature is the most common reason, but also pollution. Um, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are dead, though. Like I said, their polyps are still there. What was cool about our research is that we actually found out that the corals came back. So we had 2 years in 2014 and 2015 of these extreme heating weeks in the Florida Keys. The corals bleached 1 year during those cycles, and then we continued to take pictures of those same corals, and some of them uptook different zooxanthellae later, got their color back, and then continued to live. Now, most of them did die, and they just kind of got overtaken by the algae surrounding them. But they can reuptake zooxanthellae. So they can suck them back in and then have their color back, and their symbiotic relationship back. It's probably not the same ones that they expelled earlier, but they can uptake different ones and continue to live and grow. Um, so there is hope, and they can be resilient and continue to live, but most of the time it is a death sentence when they're bleaching. So I just wanted to kind of think about for a second, we talked about these threats and what happens to corals. And so as master naturalist, just thinking about everyday activities that contribute to these threats of corals. But then of course, ending on a hopeful note of what can you do? What can our communities do to reduce these effects and help the corals? Whether that's ones if you're traveling somewhere and they're the ones that can bleach, or ours also have some of these threats too. And you don't have to answer right now, but just thinking about it. And then we can talk more about it after the presentation, or you could type it in the chat. But just thinking about little things that you can do to help these species and yeah. I just like that little conservation message. And with that, I say thank you. Please join us for the walk on Saturday. So maybe you can take home a little piece of coral and just get to see some on the beach. And I hope you learned something new. And if you have 1,000 questions, I'm here for that. I love learning from y'all too. And I did want to say one more thing. I learned, so much from Living Beaches, and I know all of you have this book. It has so much about corals, especially the 4 species that we talked about today. If you are going to Florida or the Caribbean, and also, I mean, there's some species that live here in this book too, but Reef Creatures is an amazing book for our Caribbean species, which I also mentioned some today. So I definitely recommend this book too. But yeah, thank y'all so much. And I would love to hear from y'all now and not so much of my voice anymore. But yay, thank you.
Caroline, thank you so much. That was amazing. All of your pictures and all of your being able to talk about the experiences that you had, definitely bring it to life and everything. So I'm going to throw it open. I can read the ones that are in the chat, but you can also unmute and jump in and ask Caroline questions.
Caroline, this is Craig. I've got a question that's maybe you can clear my head, try to understand. Looking at these skeletons, it's calcium carbonate,
Yeah.
and it's created by the polyps, right?
Yes.
But when I see the skeleton on the beach, the polyps are gone. Now, the polyps might have died, but can the polyps move on and then create more skeletons from by generating the calcium carbonate, or how's that work?
Yeah. So you're asking, so the polyps are gone, yes. So when you find the skeleton, all the polyps are dead, and there's no longer any living animal like on this skeleton. So can you ask the question one more time? I think it cut off on one of what you said.
Do the polyps just die, or can they leave that skeleton behind and create another skeleton?
That's a great question. They cannot leave this behind. So once they're an adult polyp in polyp form, they cannot leave this and go somewhere else.
Huh.
Yes. So corals, I didn't talk about their reproduction, but they have re when they reproduce, some of these polyps, like this one might be a female and this one over here might be a male. And so they're gonna put out both gametes into the water, and then those gametes are going to find each other from a different coral and fertilize. And then they're going to become a planula, which is just a tiny little coral baby, and it's going to be plankton. And then eventually that planula, that plankton, is going to find a hard surface and then excrete the little base of the coral. And then it's going to start growing from there and collecting calcium and nutrients out of the water and making this skeleton.
Oh,
And then it will make the polyps. Like, I mean, each time it makes a little hole, like this is probably like one of the first polyps that created, and it's going to already have a soft body polyp inside of it as soon as it creates the skeleton.
huh.
Yeah. And so those are the adults, and they don't move except for in and out of that little hole until they die. And then it just goes like often, like the water just dissolves the dead soft body.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. That kind of cleared up the confusion in my mind of the what's going on with the skeleton and the polyps and everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I'll just jump in. So Jerry had asked, what gives the hard corals their color?
Oh, yes. So the zooxanthellae, or the little zooxanthellae is another word for that algae cell that lives inside of the hard corals. Now, if like maybe you're asking about the ones that don't have zooxanthellae, like our stony bush coral or our star coral, because they don't have those, that is just genetic. So they can vary in color from like a brown to like a yellow, but they're not as colorful as the ones that have the zooxanthellae. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Jerry.
Thanks, Caroline. Okay, and there's just lots of thank yous and that how fascinating it was, learned so much. And then another question says, does South Carolina have any plans for a program like the Eternal Reef like there is in Florida? That you know.
I don't know if I'm familiar with the Eternal Reef program in Florida. Annie, if you're still on here, I would love to hear more about that.
I don't know if she is.
I had a question about our reef, the reefs, the artificial reefs that they're putting into our coastline.
Yeah.
So you're just creating reefs because we didn't have reefs there.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was curious about. And so just to bring in more fish and to help organisms survive since we're in this decline. Okay.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
the other question was, I know the sunscreen's an issue, but I am a landscaper, and my biggest pet peeve lately has been, the pesticides and the fertilizers and things, and learning that there are no regulations on any of our islands as to who can spray what, or even knowing how much is getting put into there. And I know we're not like Florida with a whole lot of coral, but I was just wondering if that's talked about at all, or if there's something, I don't know, because that contributes to the health of our ocean, right? Just as much as sunscreen, right?
Right, yeah, and maybe even more so, or equal. I don't know if there's any, grad student, bless their hearts, out there, studying things like that. I hope so. I hope, that someone's looking into that. And I know that there's probably published papers in Florida, like you said, about stuff like that. And but I know there's not really any regulations on that, which is sad. But I'm sure it's affecting a lot of things, not just our corals, but so many animals and plants out in our waterways here. So yeah, I think just education and awareness of, potential dangers, even if there's not, a big study on it, is the best thing for that. But yeah, I don't know much about current studies on that in South Carolina.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jen.
Caroline.
Yes.
Hi, it's Laura Lovins.
Oh, hey, Laura.
Hi. I have a quick question. Are the reefs, the man-made reefs that you're making for the corals to attach, can they also, has there been any studies done to find out if they could also be like become underwater structures to help with erosional aspects to beaches
Hmm.
instead of jetties and groins, which are above water structures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't heard of anything like that, but that is kind of
I'm one
fascinating to think about, like could we use that instead of our other structures?
that are
Um,
above water.
right.
Right.
I think that's a great thought. My only thing is that our hard corals, which most of those reefs that we plant um, are going to be for our harder corals, and they prefer deeper water than and
Okay.
cooler water than what
Than what
would
we have. Yeah.
well, we a little farther offshore, right? So
Right.
in
Right.
order for the sand, um, for it to protect the beach sand from eroding, it would have to
Correct.
be closer to the shore. So that would be the
Right.
only thing that I think maybe wouldn't work. But hey, I mean, I'm all for if somebody's got science and
To do a
money to
study.
try those
Right.
things out.
Yeah. Because we're grappling with that right now here in Isle of Palms. And
Yeah.
we're getting ready for a big beach renourishment, but there's a big shoal offshore that's creating the erosion, and we're going to have to figure out ways to mitigate that. And, hard structures are being discussed, and that's why I wanted to find out if something underwater could be a viable option. But I think you're right. I think they would have to be much further out than would
Yeah.
help us, but
Yeah.
you
A
never
good
know.
thought. That's a
I'll
good thought.
I'll I'll keep
Yeah.
checking into it.
Yes. I saw that Annie responded, and it's where they can take ashes from cremation and incorporate them into the balls to create an artificial reef, which that's the way I want to go.
Me too.
So I love that. Yes, that sounds great to me. But I'm not sure. I do know when I was making the artificial reef balls at DNR, which I think anyone can volunteer for that. I'm not sure if it's like score, but um, that they did have like some pet ashes in there, and different ones that they had done, and they had sunk those. So I don't know if it's legal for the human side of things, but potentially. But I think that's such a unique and memorable way to honor someone. So thanks for asking that, Annie.
Thank you all. And such great questions. It makes me start thinking about other ways, other future Zoom topics. So if anyone has a lead on someone who might be able to talk about it, you can certainly pass them my way or share their information with me, and I'm happy to reach out. Because I think you all are asking good questions that hopefully somebody's looking into. But yeah, we can keep asking those questions. So again, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Caroline. Again, I put the link early on in the chat for Saturday. So go ahead and sign up if you haven't already. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. And thank you all for showing up tonight, and we will hopefully see you soon. Have a
Yeah,
great night.
thank you
Thanks
so
again,
much.
Caroline. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Night.
Bye.
Caroline.
Good night, all.
Bye.